week. First published more than a quarter of a century ago, the book has sold more than 1 million copies. The People Speak airs Sunday night on the History Channel.
We're reading the original words of ordinary citizens,
ones who stood up and spoke.
This is us at our best.
What was really said by regular people who had no idea they were making history.
This is The People Speak, and it's making history.
The People Speak premieres Sunday, December 13th at 8 on History.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting live from Copenhagen. This is Climate Countdown.
We are watching you. You know what to do.
We live in a connected planet, whether economically or ecologically, but we don't pay much attention to the ecologic side.
So we are seeing a redefinition of environmentalism.
Resist, mobilize, transform.
Well, I think the fact that we're talking here about very significant money.
We are suffering the most, but we have not caused the problem at the least. So for us, it's a justice issue. It is also a human rights issue.
Developed countries have a historical responsibility.
Most speakers who took part in the discussion today emphasized the importance of the Kyoto Protocol.
1.5 degrees, that's enough for our little islands in the Pacific to drown. So people, wake up. Climate change is real.
You know what to do. The number has been set. Pay your climate debt.
This is Climate Countdown. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting live from Copenhagen, here in the Bella Center, what many may consider at this point the Bella of the Beast. As debates between rich and poor nations over emission cuts and funding continue on this 5th day of the COP15 Climate Summit, here in Copenhagen, we begin with an overview of the week's developments. Inside the Bella Center, the divide is between the rich and poor nations of the world. The rich countries have proposed a climate fund of $10 billion a year from 2010 to 2012 to help developing countries adapt to climate change. Poor countries say that's too little. Meanwhile, U.S. climate negotiator Jonathan Pershing said the Obama administration's willing to pay its fair share, but added that donors, quote, don't have unlimited largesse to disperse. The lead climate negotiators for India and China addressed some of these concerns, along with the European Commission's Director General for Environment at a news conference on Friday morning.
The question is not whether it is desirable to reduce the rate of growth of emissions in developing countries. Of course it is. The question is who pays for it.
It would just be an enormous waste if we were to leave from Copenhagen not understanding that economic growth in developing countries that is crucial, a fundamental right, recognized by everyone, needs to be achieved in different forms in which economic growth has been achieved in the past, and that this is possible.
For the developed countries, when it comes to emission space, their fundamental attitude is that what is mine is mine. What I've taken away from you, I've got to keep. For us, the developing countries, our position is our emission space is under occupation, and we want them back.
That was China's top climate negotiator, Yu Qingtai, preceded by Karl Falkenberg of the European Commission and Indian climate negotiator Chandrasekhar Dasgupta. Debates have also emerged over the Kyoto Protocol itself. On Friday, the 42-member Association of Small Island States announced its proposal for the summit. Dominica Ambassador Crispin Gregoire explained their demands at a news conference.
We are on the front lines of the climate change crisis. Some of our islands will disappear, we accept that, but we want an agreement that will address our survival. That is why we're here. We want 2 legal treaties, an amended Kyoto Protocol and a legally binding treaty for the long-term cooperative action under the convention.
More on what's been taking place this week here at the Bella Center. I'm joined in Copenhagen by Kate Horner, policy analyst with Friends of the Earth. Welcome to Democracy Now! Explain what we have just watched and listened to. What's going on here? A lot of people, even inside the Bella Center, let alone the thousands of people who are gathering actually for protests beginning in the next few days, don't really understand what is being negotiated.
Well, I think that's in part because there are profoundly different conceptions of what's actually being discussed here. For the wealthy world, this is about taking moderate deviations in their emissions where they take on slightly reduced emissions targets. For the developing countries, they recognize that this is about how to share the atmosphere fairly. We have a limited global carbon budget that has been used up by the wealthy world, and they have grown prosperous on the backs of dirty energy over the course of the last 150 years. And they've used up the space that should be made available to developing countries to develop. And so what we're talking about right now on the table is how do we share the remaining space fairly amongst the whole world? How do we ensure the survival and the dignity and the livelihoods of everyone on this planet? And there's a lot of different ideas about how to do that, but I think that across the board, and just as you said, Jonathan Pershing and Todd Stern, who lead the United States delegation, say that they recognize the role that they've played in emitting carbon, but they take no responsibility or culpability for it, which means that they're not providing any space for the rest of the world to develop, which is abhorrent, really, when you think about the rest, as a number of these delegates in civil society have said. It's not just about carbon emissions. These are their lives on the line. It's their survival. It's the survival of their families, and it's not just in the small island states.
What do you mean not giving space for these countries to develop?
That's a good question. Basically, what they're talking about is instead of taking the remaining space and sharing it, they're talking about locking in future emissions. So, for example, the U.S., they'll say that they're going to reduce their emissions by 17%. That's not good enough, period. But what that also means is that they're going to lock in the rest of their emissions over the future period. And because they're locking in their pollution, means that there's no space for the rest of the world to develop.
Let's just clarify the 17% term, since the U.S. is using a different standard than everywhere else. Explain. 1990, the rest of the world. 2005, the United States.
And I mean, this is a great example of why it's difficult to understand, is because we talk about different percentages and different base years. The U.S. proposal is that's currently on the table through the legislation is 17 to 20% below 2005 levels. The rest of the world uses 1990 levels. But again, that doesn't really reflect the historical emissions that have used up the atmospheric space that are causing the problem.
And the 20% that the rest of the world is saying should be done based on the 1990 levels. Some up to 49%, like Evo Morales of Ecuador is calling for that. In 2005 terms, that's what, like 4% the U.S. is proposing. 3 to 4%.
Minimal.
Talk about the Danish text, this secret text that was leaked a few days ago. The Guardian put it out, and then everyone responded. And then what the text is today.
Sure. So let me just talk about the process of this. This is not the World Trade Organization. It's the UN, where all countries should have a fair and equal voice at the table. And what the Danish Prime Minister Rasmussen has done is totally betrayed the UN process of multilateralism, and he has betrayed the Danish people in their long history of being fair and balanced in international affairs. And he has consulted with a rich, select few countries and created a text that is essentially a marriage of the EU proposal and the US proposal. So regardless of the fact that the text is abhorrent and reflects the needs and desires of the rich world and totally ignores the rest of the world, the fact that he's even created a text is unacceptable. And I think that's on both counts. Developing countries have been very clear that it's unacceptable.
And the text now?
And the text now, we don't know. Hopefully, the Danish Prime Minister has heard the message that the process needs to continue under the negotiations ongoing, but it's entirely possible that they are continuing to draft new versions of the text to be issued next week as ministers and heads of state arrive. Talk about the arrival of the ministers and heads of state. We're talking about more than 100 of them, including President Obama, who will arrive on the last day on Friday. What kind of pressure is being exerted? What is going to happen in this next week? In the rest of the show, we're going to talk about what's going to happen outside and maybe inside the Bella Center. But what's going to happen with the delegates? So ministers are, right now we have delegations here. These are negotiators. These are often technocrats who are coming here to lobby on behalf of their countries. Ministers who are going to come on the weekend are going to have to engage on some of the political questions. They may answer them or they may defer to their heads of state. I think that the concern here is that these folks who are in political positions may come under extraordinary pressure from the wealthy world. We are talking about a situation in which the wealthy world recognizes the stakes on the table, and they have brought their considerable economic and political influence, like the early days of colonization, to bear in this process. We know of a couple of examples already. In Barcelona, the Algerian delegate led the Africa group in a very strong demand to focus the negotiations on emissions reductions. What's at the heart of this?